Sego, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, June 4th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage, and in some cases, start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we will do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation live. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind you that our audio streams on our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. We stream the video of our show live on Facebook Live. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud and offer it up as podcasts after the broadcast. And we take the video and we put it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. I am the host of Let's Talk Native, and I'm assisted here in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our video and our sound. We opened up with White Man Card because we're celebrating, kinda. So last Sunday was the 95th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. I guess that's the day that we got our own White Man cards. Well, not quite. I'm going to break this down a little bit for you because look, our people are really confused. Identity, because of the policies of assimilation, all of it. I mean, going right back to extermination and removal and assimilation, termination, even this so-called self-determination. Because of all that, we have a real identity problem. And these acts, like the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, just contribute to it all. But I want to back up even farther, even before 1924. In 1868, that's when they passed the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment was supposed to make everybody citizens. Of course, it was really geared towards coming out of the Civil War, so former slaves would be considered citizens. But interestingly enough, even though they passed that, it clearly did not apply to us. And of course, part of the reason it didn't apply to us is the language of the 14th Amendment talked about people being under the jurisdiction of the United States. Not just being born or naturalized, as they say, but being under the jurisdiction. And we weren't. And proof of that is that in 1924, they would pass this Indian Citizenship Act. But let me back up only a few years before that, because there was a conversation about this that went on between the New York State Indian Commission and the Federal Indian Commission over this very subject. See, New York State had gotten to a place in 1920 where they realized that they had been paying out treaty payments and other things, providing other services to the quote unquote Indians of New York, and learned that they may not have had the legal right to do so. They may have been misappropriating state funds because the federal government really had that responsibility. So the state put together a New York State Indian Commission headed up by a man by the name of Edward Everett. And his job was to produce a report. And so Edward Everett put together a whole commission, board, including guys like A.C. Parker, somebody who many Senecas are aware of, but put together this commission and then traveled throughout all of quote unquote Indian country within New York State. And not only did he meet with Native people, but he also met with the federal government. And part of the Everett report, which was produced in 1920, detailed it basically had the transcript from the meeting between the New York State Indian Commission and the Federal Indian Commission. And part of the debate had to do with the services that the state was providing, the federal government was supposed to provide, including things like medical and whether Native people, the whole jurisdictional thing, especially associated with education and that kind of stuff. And so the federal government flat out threw it out there. It says, well, why don't we just make them all citizens? Well, Edward Everett himself weighed in on this, and he said, well, that's absurd. You can't just make a people who predate our existence U.S. citizens. I mean, you couldn't do that to somebody from another country who came to the United States, just make them citizens against their will or without their request. That would be absurd. And especially since Everett knew that the reason the federal government was trying to do it was to solve a problem they had, which was a jurisdictional problem. So that was in 1920 that he submitted the report that included this transcript. A mere 4 years later, a New York State congressman by the name of Snyder would propose this Citizenship Act, and the claim that is tried to that they try to make historically, which isn't necessarily true, was that this was being proposed because of the number of Native people who were enlisting in the armed forces. Well, they could have been made citizens if that's what they wanted to do. They could have done that through the process of enlistment if they wanted to. So the idea that they wanted to pass this Citizenship Act in 1924 wasn't about accommodating. Look, I do know that Native people enlist at a higher rate proportionally than any other group of people within in the Northern Hemisphere or in the Western Hemisphere. I get that, but it's still not that big a number. I mean, I realize when we talk about proportionality, it always sounds like a lot, but Native people didn't win the war in World War I or World War II. But so this thing gets sometimes embellished, so to speak. The fact of the matter is Native people do enlist at a higher rate than anybody else. But it's still not a very big number because it's a percentage of our population, which is, especially back then, was right now we're only about 0.7%. So in the 1900s or 1920s, we were probably less than 2%, 0.2%. I mean, it was a pretty small number. Maybe we may not have made 0.1% for all I know. So small number anyway. But so this debate went between the state Indian Commission and the federal Indian Commission, and it was pretty much shot down by New York State, by those people from the New York State Commission. And of course, we didn't weigh in on this conversation. Native people weren't consulted on this thing. So, again, 95 years ago, last Sunday, the House and the Senate passed an act, and I'll read it here for you. And this is the Indian Citizenship Act. It says, "Be it enacted by the state and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the U.S. be and they are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, provided that granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property." That's an interesting provided passage. Because if you read this thing, the way it's passed, it says, yes, we're citizens, but doesn't mean we lose anything by becoming citizens, which is the exact reason they tried to grant us, impose citizenship upon us. They wanted to this was about like the final leg of conquest, even though they tried to say discovery and conquest was the same, coming out of Johnson v. McIntosh and Chief Justice John Marshall, and they tried to say over and over again that Native people were conquered. But I'll tell you, if they pass a law like this and declare that we're citizens and we just go along with it, then we surrender. I mean, we submit. We allow ourselves to be subjugated by the United States. Now, the other thing I want to mention here, in 1924, it was already being discussed because of coming out of World War I, that the idea of denationalizing, stripping a people of national character and imposing another nation's character upon them, that's already being talked about as a war crime in 1924. So that's exactly what the United States proposed in this Indian Citizenship Act. Now, they don't say it. Again, they have language in there say, well, we're not taking anything away. Funny thing is, then how are they imposing taxes on us? That's not our personal property? I mean, the fact that Seneca Nation officials who literally are voted in to sit on council and be executives, how is that not tribal property that is being stripped away from them? They're being paid for their service to the Seneca Nation. wait a minute, your Indian Citizenship Act said nothing in this Citizenship Act shall affect our access to our own property. Well, isn't income our own personal property? Of course it is. Of course, there's still a question mark, because just because the United States declared it to be so, just because the U.S. Senate, House and Senate assembled, declared this thing, doesn't mean that it's so, especially when you consider that whole provided passage there. Just because they said it doesn't make it so. I mean, we have a choice in this matter. We can accept whether we want to be U.S. citizens or not. We don't have to abandon our national character, our cultural character, for, to pledge allegiance to the United States of America. We don't have to do that. And in fact, many haven't. Many didn't. Ironically, they do this coming out of the First World War. And in the Second World War, all of a sudden, Native people started getting draft registrations. And so our people said, wait, you can't draft us. We're not U.S. citizens. Oh, yeah, we passed that law back in 1924. Yeah, but that didn't apply to us. I mean, you can't impose that upon us. And in fact, to kind of solve or do a little bit of damage control, do a fix, the Six Nations actually declared war on the Axis powers themselves, which kind of made it, I don't know, somehow justify the fact that, again, Native people were enlisting at a pretty high rate. So even though our people were serving in the U.S. military, or even on the Canadian side in the Canadian military, we were doing so because of our own declaration of war, apparently. I got to tell you, we didn't ever sit at the table for the surrender agreements, the armistice treaty. So apparently we're still at war with Germany and Japan, but don't tell anybody because they might get pissed. But again, the other part that's kind of crazy about all this is this still doesn't accomplish what they want to accomplish. Not only did the 14th Amendment not make us U.S. citizens, this didn't either. Now, how do I know that? Because 10 years later, they would pass the Indian Reorganization Act, the IRA. And this was an attempt, once again, to make us all citizens. Now, how do I know that? Because if you are in a debate over trying to put land into trust, one of the criterion for a native peoples to take land out of fee, owned by the state or whatever else, deeded by the state, and put it into trust to take it in his native land. One of the criterion is that, well, you had to be under the jurisdiction of the United States in 1934. Otherwise, you can't. Well, wait a second. Aren't citizens under the jurisdiction of the United States? See, that's not even addressed in 1924. Notice there's nothing in there that says anything about us being under the jurisdiction of the United States or subjected to the jurisdiction of the United States. No language in there whatsoever. The only language in there is that, again, provided that granting of such citizenship shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. I mean, that's the only qualification of that act, which to me is a big deal, because I don't know how, even if the United States claims that we're citizens, that they can somehow tax us or they can do anything that affects our right on our territory. Now, granted, I know it might be a little bit of a different game when we don't live on native territory, if we live in the city or whatever else. But when we live on native lands, how is, even if the United States claims, even if we claim that we're U.S. citizens by virtue of this act, that doesn't mean that they have jurisdiction over us, because jurisdiction inherently takes something away. So even this act, which was specifically meant to declare that we were all citizens, doesn't do it. And not only does it not do it, it was objected to by the State Indian Commission, and it was being condemned by the entire world. In fact, when you come out of World War II, there would be a new word that would be used. They don't use they stop using denationalization, because that starts to take on a little bit of a different meaning. So they come up with a new word, genocide. Now, genocide includes this notion of denationalization, the idea of creating the conditions that a people will cease to exist as those people. Well, that's genocide. That's denationalization. That's the idea of stripping away somebody's national character. Now, it's interesting that they would try to do this in 1924 because that's right smack in the middle, essentially, of the boarding school era. So you got to think that part of the rationale to doing this is the fact that they're still trying to justify what they're doing to Native people. The idea that they're ripping our kids from families and putting them in these residential schools. I think it's important that people understand this. So anytime I see somebody post something on Facebook, it's, well, today's the anniversary of us becoming U.S. citizens. No. Or today's the anniversary of them granting us citizens. No, they didn't grant us citizenship. They declared it. They imposed it. They attempted to impose it. But we don't have to accept it. I mean, I did a show a year ago on a show, an NPR show called The Takeaway with Tanzina Vega. And it starts out with me just saying, look, I'm not a U.S. citizen. Now, maybe people take offense to that. There are some Native people who take offense to that. Well, why do I have to be a U.S. citizen? Why is that even necessary? I mean, there's certainly no benefit to it. I mean, and according to their own Citizenship Act, they still don't have the right to interfere, to affect any of my personal property or my property on native lands, although they certainly have done that, which shows that it was fraud. That the whole reason for passing the Indian Citizenship Act was not to grant us something. It was not to award us with some privilege of being a U.S. citizen. It was to solve a problem that they had, because they would continue to wrestle with this idea that there's a people who live on shared lands or that we share boundaries anyway, that are not a part of us. We kind of addressed it with the black folk in 1868, although not really, because then you enter Jim Crow era for another century. The whole idea of racism, which every people of color experienced in the United States, including and especially those of us who were here before the United States. So this idea of this declaration of citizenship, I mean, it doesn't even talk about a process. It just says, oh, you are. I mean, so when I have a conversation, even today, if I have a conversation with a state legislator or a lawyer, or a federal legislator or whoever, they can't even wrap their heads around the idea that I'm not a U.S. citizen. Well, yeah, you said, but I'm not a U.S. citizen. Well, yeah, we know, but no, don't dismiss what I just told you. You can't impose U.S. citizenship upon us. It was considered a war crime when you did it in 1924. It would be affirmed even further and added more detail to it when the word would no longer be denationalization, when it would be genocide. To try to force us into U.S. citizenship, which you're still doing, you're still trying to force us. Not only are you dismissive when we say we're not a U.S. citizen, but look at the whole passport issue. I mean, I went to in front of the United Nations, last August, and I tried to raise the issue because the theme of their World Indigenous Peoples Day was migration and movement of indigenous peoples. I said, well, we have a problem here, because the United States and Canada and other countries that may be willing to receive us won't let us provide our own travel documents. They're insisting, before we can even get on a plane, I mean, they are prohibiting us from leaving North America on a flight. They're saying, no, you can't. You can't unless you have a U.S. or Canadian passport. Wait, no, I've got my own documents. I've got a Haudenosaunee passport. I've got this. Oh, no, that's they call those fake documents. They call them counterfeit documents. So This is another example of them trying to force or impose their citizenship. They're saying, no, you have to have a U.S. travel document, but I'm not a U.S. citizen. Yeah, but but you're native. I know, but you don't issue passports to people who aren't citizens unless you're a Samoan. The Isles of Samoa are the only people who are not U.S. citizens who can travel with a U.S. passport. They can be listed as U.S. nationals. Well, I'm not even a U.S. national. But see, and you won't accommodate. I mean, look, I would travel with a U.S. passport as long as I could say the passport clearly said I'm not a U.S. citizen, that I'm Mohawk, I'm Gunyakahaga. I would do that. It wouldn't be my preference. My preference would be for us to travel on our own travel documents. But you can't impose your U.S. citizenship upon us. You couldn't do it in 1924, and you can't do it today. So I do have to correct people when they say, well, yeah, they passed the Indians, they made us citizens in 1924. No, they didn't. You may have made yourself a U.S. citizen. You may have accepted that declaration as valid, but not everybody did. There are many people who didn't. And now, I mean, this, you take a few generations later here, I mean, we're coming up on 100 years of this thing. And we have a whole lot of people who are conflicted over this. So, again, 1868, you had the 14th Amendment that tries to make everybody citizens. Didn't work. In 1924, they tried to pass this Indian Citizenship Act. Still didn't work. In 1934, they passed the Indian Reorganization Act, trying to make us all into little USA municipalities under their jurisdiction. Well, that didn't work. And they know it didn't work because they still are asking. They're asking us, well, were you under jurisdiction, under our jurisdiction, 1934? Well, I vote no. No, we weren't. My family wasn't. And you know what? Even if my family was, my family can't sell out my birthright. The whole idea of being born, ungwe, is that I get to choose. In our culture, it is prohibited. It is wrong. It is illegal, if you want to call it that, for somebody to strip somebody else's character away. Even if it's dad or mom doing it to their son or daughter. We can compromise ourselves. We shouldn't, but we do. We can compromise ourselves, but we can't sell out future generations. We have this thing called 7 generations, right? We talk about it all the time, but it gets twisted. Some people try to make it sound like, well, there's something spiritual or prophetic about the 7th generation. No, that's not what it means. I mean, maybe some cultures have that. So I'm not trying to, I know people have different ideas of this thing, but in Haudenosaunee, or Haudenosaunee culture, the idea of this responsibility we have to the 7th generation, it's not the 7th generation. It is really a responsibility we have to future generations. The next one after that, and including the generations that we won't ever live to see. The idea, the reason we use 7 is because we might live to see 5 generations or even 6. Maybe. We may not, our minds may not be very clear by the time we get to that age. But the likelihood is that we will not see the 7th generation. So we have a responsibility to those faces we will never see. Yeah, and they're our families. But even if they weren't our families, they're still part of us. So we talk about our ancestors, but we don't talk about the future generations. That's what that 7th generation issue is all about. So regardless of what anybody did in 1924, that wasn't even 7 generations ago, by the way. Regardless of how anybody accepted this or didn't accept it, because first off, let me be clear. Most people were completely unaware. Most Native people didn't know what they were doing in Washington. They weren't a part of these consultations. So when Washington passes a law, even if they want to claim that it abrogated a treaty, nobody comes to us and says, hey, by the way, everything we agreed to 10 years ago doesn't exist anymore. They don't come and tell us that. So when they passed this law in 1924, it's not like people came knocking on the door, of our homes to say, oh, by the way, you're a U.S. citizen now. You're not a Mohawk anymore. You're not a Seneca anymore. You're not Gunyagahaga or Nunduwaga. You are American. Here's your flag. No, no, they didn't do that. Of course they didn't do that. And like I said, when they started trying to draft people in for World War II, that's the first time our people said, wait, what is this? You've never done this before. Now you're trying to say we have to enlist? And then they tried it again, Korea or coming into Vietnam. In Vietnam, they started trying to draft people. We had more people say, "You're not drafting us." We had people reject that. I don't know anybody, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know anybody who was ever prosecuted, like Muhammad Ali was, for instance, who was native, who rejected the draft. Now, look, when I went through this on Memorial Day with some folks, somebody was, well, my such and such, my uncle, my father, my grandfather, didn't have a choice because he was drafted. Yeah, he had a choice. Muhammad Ali had a choice. He had more to lose than most people. We had places to hide out if somebody wanted to come try to take us and enlist us. We'd have to go to Canada. And frankly, if we did go to Canada, we probably got family there. So, no, we were in the best position to avoid the draft. And many people did. Not everybody did, but many people did. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and we'll come back. But I'm not done with this thing yet. I think it's really important that people understand that in 1924, we weren't granted citizenship. It was an attempt by the United States to impose it on us, to subjugate us, to make us U.S. citizens. And that's not legal. It's not binding. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back.
If you drink that water, red blue, red blue, red blue, baby, red blue. Every kind of people got every kind of.
Hey, I want to thank our sponsors. Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses and Eric White and ERW Enterprises. A few people who choose to remain nameless. And of course, we do encourage those who on occasion will drop a check in the mail or say, give me a call and say, hey, stop by. We'd like to support what you're doing. We don't get enough of those, and we sure could use it. We're trying as we go to improve our product here. We've got another video that'll come out over the next couple of days. Again, on the doctrine of discovery, talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all of that. And you'll see, our production value is going up a little higher. We're trying to use multiple cameras and we're trying to do some things. We've done some improvements here in studio. But in order to do that, we need your support. So again, I appreciate those of you who do provide consistent support to the show, and those of you who think about us from time to time. Think about us from time to time, and again, we appreciate that as well. Hey, I also want to thank those of you who offer your comments and who engage in the conversations that I post on Facebook or Twitter or wherever else. You remember, you can also comment on the YouTube videos. There is a section you can go down below the video and offer your comments there as well. Those of you who share the show, whether you're sharing the Facebook live stream like my wife does on so many group pages, or whether you share a podcast or the YouTube video, I appreciate all of it. And I also appreciate those of you who allow us to share the show on your group pages and your Facebook pages. So again, let's keep the conversation going. You don't have to necessarily agree with everything that I say. I try to be factually accurate. I mean, but look, I am expressing opinions at the same time. But to be clear, on this issue, just because the United States declared that Native people were citizens doesn't mean that it's so. The United States says a lot of things, and they aren't necessarily true. In fact, they've got a guy who's currently occupying the White House who barely can say a true word on any given day. Look, I talked a little bit about the doctrine or the Declaration of Citizenship that they did in 1924, but I want to back up to the Everett Report again, because this is an interesting thing that was done here. Because what New York State did was they wanted to understand what was the obligation that was due to Native people. And so when this Everett Report was done in 1920 and was actually submitted to the New York State legislature, the legislature wouldn't even take it. They wouldn't accept it. I mean, it landed like a lead balloon. Why? Because Edward Everett, who was the only commissioner willing to sign the report, by the way, made certain determinations based on the research that he did. And he considered where the United States was in the world at the time. He weighed out the blood and treasure that was spent by the United States on the European front in World War I. A battle that didn't really involve us, but the United States, stepped up and many people enlisted, including Native people. But what he talked about was for all of the blood and treasure that was sacrificed for this noble cause, against the Germans and all that other stuff in Europe. He says, how do we not address what has transpired with Native people? And he acknowledged that that we, the Six Nations in particular, that we had valid claims to land. And that New York State could not assert certain powers over Native peoples, that we were truly an independent people. And that's why he took the position he took against the Federal Indian Commission when they, at the mere suggestion that they would just try to impose U.S. citizenship upon us. He thought it was absurd. He compared it to somebody from another country being here that you wouldn't do that to. So how could you do it to somebody who predates their existence? He talked about how absurd the proposition was. But just like the Everett Report, the report from the New York State Indian Commission in 1920, it landed with a thud, and the U.S. the federal government did what they did anyway. So they passed this law, and again, it leaves so much out. I mean, there's so very little detail there. I mean, it just basically says we declare you're all citizens, and then goes on to say that nothing in this act shall affect or in any way impair the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. Well, we're constantly in a battle with not only New York State, with the federal government over our property, not just our property in terms of real estate, what we do on our lands, but everything from from our income to the work that we do to any of the commerce that we perform. This is all about our property being affected and being impaired by the state and the federal government. So once again, and this isn't even a treaty. This is a piece of legislation. This is the United States passing a law, and then they don't follow it. Now, I don't know. I can never find any proof or any event or legislation or treaty or any kind of agreement where the United States can categorically say, we became theirs. Even this, where the United States can say that we surrendered our sovereignty, that we transferred our national character and surrendered it to the United States. Because it doesn't exist. Even this doesn't do it. So I guess my message to folks out there who oftentimes it's so easy to just repeat information the way it's dished out to you. Oh yeah, in 1924 we all became citizens. No, we didn't. We didn't all become citizens. Many of us still reject it to this day, but many people rejected it then. I mean, you have to understand what the United States was trying to pull off in 1924. And it was met with resistance, not just by the Six Nations, but by people all over the country. Now, look, there were some people who wanted to become U.S. citizens. In fact, there were already Native people who had become U.S. citizens. It wasn't like it was totally prohibited. There were people who served in the military. There were other people who did various things that, you know, in anticipation of being awarded U.S. citizenship, they did some of those things. But the vast majority of Native people in 1924, they weren't applying for citizenship. They weren't trying to be Americans. They were Dene. They were, Ojibwe. They were Anishinaabe. They were Lakota. They were, Onondaga. They were Ganyagaaga, Onyotaaga. They were all these people with very distinct character. They were Onoilwe. They were original people. They didn't need to be stamped by people who came, only a couple, in this case, barely a couple of hundred years before. I mean, so the idea that the United States could just impose its citizenship upon people, and the worst part about it is how many of our people just accept it. I mean, even getting back to the whole passport issue. I know so many Native people say, well, I want to travel, so I'll just get a U.S. passport. But you've got to claim U.S. citizenship to get that. It's right there on the document. Hell, if you to go down to the Seneca Nation and get an enhanced tribal card, even an enhanced tribal card. What's an enhanced tribal card, you say? Well, it is a card that is a federal ID. Oh, it's not a Seneca ID. Seneca's pay for it, and they issue it, but it's a federal ID that says Seneca Nation on the top. Well, why is it a federal ID? Because they're the ones to produce their criteria. Five requirements on that the nations had to put together for this enhanced tribal card. One is that you have to prove your citizenship, either Canada or the United States. Maybe Mexico too. I don't know how they deal with it down there on the Texas border and such. But here, you can if you can provide your Canadian citizenship, you can still get an enhanced tribal card from on this side through the approved by the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, in the Department of Homeland Security. But you have to prove. I mean, when you look at the Seneca documents that were, the Seneca Nation's documents for an enhanced tribal card, the first requirement is proof of citizenship. So it's not that you're a Seneca citizen. You've got to be an American citizen or a Canadian, or a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen. That's the first requirement. The second one is the picture that's on the ID has to be shot in such a way that they can pull data points off your face so they can submit, and it has to be compatible with the federal government's facial recognition technology so you could be put in their system. The third thing is there has to be a renewal date, an expiration date on the ID. That way, in case your face changes a little bit, we got to make sure that we get a current picture. The fourth requirement, they wanted a scannable strip, whether it's a barcode or again one of those readable strips on the card. Now, don't know what information pulls up on that strip. Seneca Nation wasn't providing that. This is the federal government doing that. And they wanted an RFID chip. Now, why would you want an RFID chip? Well, the RFID chip enables them to read the card without you ever giving it to them. For all intents and purposes, they could read it in your wallet. Oh, they claim that we'll give you a sleeve. You can put it in a sleeve, and nobody can read it unless you take it out of the sleeve. Okay, if you believe that, all right, maybe. But at the end of the day, they wanted 2 ways to read the card. Those were 2 of the requirements. They wanted an expiration date so your picture could stay current. They wanted your photograph to be compatible with federal recognition, U.S. federal government facial recognition technology. And first and foremost, they wanted proof of U.S. citizenship or Canadian citizenship. Now, and here's what they did. So when you get that Seneca Nation enhanced tribal card, they put a flag on it. I mean, literally, in the corner. They're either going to put an American flag or a Canadian flag, because you can't be a Seneca citizen. You have to be a Canadian citizen or a U.S. citizen to get a Seneca Nation enhanced tribal card. This is more of this forced denationalization, just like 1924, just like this Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. And we become complicit. You know, look, the Seneca Nation never imposed these IDs on people. In fact, it got done during the Porter administration. I think only about 100 people in the entire Seneca Nation actually ever got these things. It's been a complete debacle. You know, just a waste of money. They spent millions doing it. And I think the only people who really got them were probably Seneca Nation employees, because they were encouraged to do it, I guess. But again, here's the problem. The problem is that you have to prove you're a U.S. citizen or a Canadian citizen. Now, back on the citizenship issue, we also have this other debate that comes up from time to time, which has to do with the registration for the draft. Now, I'm one of those guys who was born just before the new requirement came out to register for the draft, the current one that's on the books today. I'm born at the end of December in 1959. If I was born 10 days later, 11 days later, I would have been, according to their laws, required to register for the draft. Of course, I wouldn't have done it. Most Native people, I would say, I don't even know. Many Native people don't register for the draft. Now, how do we interpret that? I mean, so do we take the position that it's simply not required of us, that we're exempt because we're not U.S. citizens? Because you can't draft Native people? We can't get that even clarified. You know, the Seneca Nation doesn't even come out with a strong position. I mean, Seneca Nation should issue some directive, right, to boys when they turn 18. Our boys turn 18, Native boys in the local schools, and the schools are telling them they have to do this stuff. There's nobody guiding them. You know, hopefully parents, but most parents are oblivious to this. I mean, if you're my age or older, you didn't even go through this thing. You don't even know what this is, right? But if you're younger than me, maybe you registered for the draft, maybe you didn't. But are you directing your kids to do it? See, this is one of these huge question marks. And it ties directly to this so-called declaration in 1924 that said we were citizens. Well, how could imposing a draft registration not be considered impairing us on our property or our rights? I mean, it seems like freedom is a right, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy that when they passed this thing in 1924, and they put this caveat on here that, that such citizens shall not in any manner impair or otherwise affect the right of any Indian to tribal or other property. I mean, and yet we're in a constant battle over just our income. Like I said, how crazy is it that if you get elected onto the council in Seneca Nation, and I'm sure that's the same way in Akwesasne or and those guys who are the so-called traditionals in Onondaga, does Sid Hill pay federal income tax? I don't know. I know the IRS paid them a visit. I know the IRS has gone to Tonawanda and paid them visits. And then we don't hear anything. So what's the position? What's the position of the Seneca Nation? What's the position of the Tonawanders, the Tuscaroras, and the Onondagas? We won't even sit in the same room and talk about it. Why? Maybe because we're all embarrassed. But how is it that the federal government can take away 25 to 30% of our income. I mean, that's money that for our families, that we're supposed to support our families with. What possible scenario could have been created that allows the federal government, especially when they say it, even in their Citizenship Act, then nothing in this declaration, nothing in this granting the citizenship shall impair us from our property. Well, it seems to me, income from our wages, from the sale of our labor, is personal property, or and in some cases even tribal property. If you work for the Seneca Nation, how does the federal government place itself in between the service that you provide to your people, to the Seneca Nation, and to the people of the Seneca Nation, and the payment that you receive for that service? How does the federal government get in there? Because I can't find any place, not in this law, 95th anniversary of this law, not in this law or any law. And yet, if you talk to a lawyer about trying to fight some sort of income tax lien, lawyers say, oh, no, you can't win. You can't win. Well, this gets back to the conversation I had with Peter DeRico on my show in New York. And he says, sometimes you have to fight even if you're going to lose. Because it's only through fighting that you can win. If you don't fight, then you're already lost. I mean, it took a while for the Civil Rights Act to get passed. It took a while before segregation, was forced to be to have ended. I mean, we're still looking at the fight that happens, because of racial discrimination. And look, there are international conventions, there's U.S. law, there's state law, all kinds of laws that are supposed to, combat racism. But it's still there. You still have black people earning far less money than white people. You have black people who are employed at a much lower rate than white people are. And of course, we're right there with black folks. Now, and even among white people, just from a gender standpoint, women can't make as much money as men can. How is that legal? See, these are the things that you have to fight for, even if you're not going to win it immediately. I mean, because I talk about it all the time. Sometimes there's bad rulings that come down, and those bad rulings are the things that you got to keep poking a pin at. Like Ruth Bader Ginsburg citing the doctrine of Christian discovery in an Oneida case. A terrible ruling on 2, 3, maybe even 4 fronts. But a ruling nonetheless. But if we don't point to it, that's why, it's one of the reasons that I applaud that the state of Washington versus Cougar Den, which was a company, a fuel delivery company in Yakima territory, that the Yakima Nation provided a brief in that case. They weren't the defendant. They provided it on behalf of this company. They're a company that operated on their territory, and they went all in with this thing. They went after the doctrine of Christian discovery. They went after all of it. They had 2 major parts of the brief they submitted. The court never even addressed the whole doctrine of discovery issue, but they acknowledged the treaty argument that the Yakima had made, and then they ruled in favor of Cougar Den. Barely 5-4 decision. Neil Gorsuch, Trump appointee, is the one was the swing vote with the liberals. I talked about this a couple of shows ago. But if you don't fight this stuff, you'll never win it. Sometimes you got to fight, and sometimes that fight is tough. I mean, the problem is we've lost our fight. We haven't lost the fight. We lost our fight. Not a whole lot of people are willing to sacrifice. I mean, they'll go to jail for drinking. They'll go to jail for beating up their wife. But will they go to jail to stand up when they stand up to the federal government or the state government? Look, it's not, not something that you do voluntarily, but sometimes you got to fight this stuff. That's the only way we can win. is by putting up a fight. And one of the things to fight is this idea that they can impose their citizenship upon us. So next year when this rolls around, I would love to see more people say it's the 96th anniversary of them passing a law where they tried to make us U.S. citizens. Man, I would love to see that posted. I offered my commentary on pretty much every post that I saw about the anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act, and on every one of those posts that I offered my commentary on, it was received well. People say, "Oh man, I'm glad you said that." Well, again, I say in my opening that we not only have conversations, but we start conversations, but the whole idea is for you to continue the conversation. So next year and throughout the year, maybe we have to rethink this whole idea of who we are. Look, we're going to see it. I mean, as 2020 election rolls through, and look, they're going to do a census and coming up here soon. Are we afraid to say that we're not citizens of the United States? I mean, are we scared of that? I mean, if there's no place for us on their form, I mean, because look, if they say, "Are you a U.S. citizenship?" Are you a U.S. citizen? If not, what's your, I don't know, your immigration number or status or whatever else? No, neither one of those apply. They're never going to change those forms until we make them change those forms. So we either don't fill out the forms, or we lie, and we say that we're something that we're not when they ask us, and then in private we say, "Oh yeah, I just put that down." Well, sorry, you kind of can't have it both ways. You've got to take a stand. And look, it's high time for the Seneca Nation and other nations to step up on the passport issue, step up on the birth certificate issue, step up on the travel document issue in general. Not an enhanced tribal card, compliant with the Department of Homeland Security of the United States. No, not that. But if we don't go to the United Nations and raise hell every year that they have this permanent forum on indigenous issues about the failure of all of those nations that come there every year, throughout the year, to recognize that we have a right to produce our own travel documents. Why? Because you said so. The United Nations said it over and over and over again. Declaration of Human Rights, Convention Against Racism, Convention Against Genocide, Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You said it over and over and over again throughout your entire existence. But when it comes down to where the rubber meets the road, it gets real weak. The UN gets real weak in the knees. Why? Because we're not giving them any strength either. We need to assert ourselves. We need to assert ourselves home. We need to assert ourselves in the state capitals, in the national capitals, and at the United Nations. It is high time that Native people asserted their right to be Native people. Not Native Americans or American Indians or of Indian descent. No, as Ongwe, as the people who predated Europeans coming to our shores, establishing a country on our lands, imposing their will on our lands, on Hawaii, on Puerto Rico, on in the Philippines, in South America, Alaska, the Caribbean in general. The United States has military presence in 70 countries around the world. If anybody even began to have that kind of military presence, the United States would cry foul. Look, we're not fighting for global domination. We're just fighting for our own distinction and autonomy. A free and independent existence. Doesn't sound very threatening. But that's where we need to place ourselves. We can't talk about decolonization and celebrate the 95th anniversary of the Indian Citizenship Act. I know, again, nobody was really celebrating it, but it got posted a few times. And I had to provide some language to that. That's why I wanted to do the show today. It is important that we assert our distinction and our autonomy. I mean, sovereignty is a kind of a crazy word, and it's not one of our things. But in our language, we say we have the power, we have the right to carry ourselves. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 was an attempt to strip that right away and say, no, you are not the distinct people that you've been. They tried to say in 1924, we cease to be those people. Oh, they try to put a little caveat in there, say, oh, you can retain some things. But your citizenship, you're Americans now. You're a United States citizen. No, I'm not. Not that's not us. So anyway, that's my show on this issue, and we'll talk about it more as we go forward. Again, I want you to look for our video that'll be coming out over the next couple of days. I think you'll be pleased with it, and I appreciate you guys offering comments and sharing the video. Make sure it's not going to be a long one, so you're not going to invest a tremendous amount of time, but take a look at it, pass it around, and get some feedback on it. I am going to New York this week, so in fact, I've got Lance Gums joining me from Shinnecock on my show in New York on WBAI. You can listen to us Thursday at 4 p.m. from 4 to 5 p.m. You can listen to us via the WBAI website, which is www.wbai.org, or just like with this show, we'll Facebook live stream it. So you can catch us on Facebook Live, and then we'll put the show up on a podcast and a YouTube video afterwards. So look for us Thursday as well. And then we'll see you on Saturday as well. Again, this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. See you then.